Greetings. Hope everyone's doing well, staying well. I want to get into Chapter 8, some more cool things in geography. And this time around, we're going to be talking about political geography and boundaries and these types of things. In this chapter, I want to become aware of the influence of political boundaries, recognize the unifying and splintering forces in a society, and understand the corrupt atmosphere in national and state capitals. Some of the major terms are we talking about in this chapter? The state. We're talking about state. We're talking about a political entity. The nation, the people that occupy that. A nation state. Nation state's the boundaries of that political entity. We're going to talk about an elongated state. Elongated state are states that are, stretched from north to south. Chile, Sweden, Norway, Italy. Some of the major ones that come to mind here. Compact states, more circular. Of course, there's no perfect circle, but we'll analyze that. Exclaves, these are politically connected states surrounded by another state and politically connected maybe to that state or another entity. Enclaves, surrounded by a state but not politically connected. And there's different types of boundaries, right? You have your subsequent boundaries. These are drawn up after the cultural landscape was drawn. Consequent boundaries, these were drawn to accommodate an ethnicity. You have your superimposed boundaries. Superimposed boundaries were basically forced by an occupying country. And then I forgot to list it on here, but the antecedent boundary, right, classified by areas that were before being populated, and like the U.S.-Canadian border. So before it was populated, the boundaries were drawn up. And let me see what we have next here. Oh, I got forces, unifying forces, disrupting forces in a country. The centripetal forces, these are forces that unify us. Centrifugal forces, forces that are disruptive. And then the EEZ, the Exclusive Economic Zone. This is the United Nations Forum that set up boundaries on the sea. We'll talk about that. And then bad one here, political boundaries, gerrymandering. You have your voting districts out there, and we'll talk about that. That's at the end. They kind of get carved up to basically save incumbents that are already in office, that allow them to keep their seats. And we'll certainly get into that. So let's dive into the lecture model here, and I'm going to set up the first section here. We're going to talk about states and sovereign entities. And you could turn to page 218, figure 8.4 if you have your books. Got some important visuals for you to be looking at, which will help you visual types out, as I like to say. As I set this up here, the political geography, again, another one of these cool things in geography, studies political phenomena, kind of a spatial context and the impact of political actions on society. Political control is exercised at many levels. The world as a whole is divided into states, sovereign entities of defined extent, and permanent population. The deepest contrasts in culture generally occur between rather than within countries. The number of countries or states has increased greatly, in fact, since World War II. Now, the term national state describes a state whose territory corresponds with the homeland area of a particular people or culture or a nation, if you will. Let's take a look at the fills here. States and sovereign entities. A state. A state is a political entity with sovereign control over its foreign and domestic activities. A nation is a people occupying that state. They've shared cultural characteristics. And basically, what I mean there is what they believe and the customs that they employ. There's a strong ethnocentrism that is the underlying element for unification. Then a nation state. Nation states, the boundaries, right, of the cultural unity of the people occupying the nation. These boundaries help share a unifying distinctiveness. Now, a colony. A colony is not a state in that there are no cultural or physical lines that give one political independence, which would therefore help assure a conscious attempt at delineating one's sovereign rights from another's. Now we're on page 219. You turn there and get there myself. 219. There was a rapid number of sovereign states that cropped up since World War II, and these were a result, and you can see here in Africa, these were a result of European carvings. Perhaps the disarray among European countries during the first half of the 20th century, the colonies began to adopt a philosophy that it might serve their long-term purposes better if they were in control of their own affairs, being that they had cultural connections, the natives being in control of their own affairs, because they had cultural connections that the Europeans could really never begin to understand. I guess another thing that happened along the way was World War II, which drained the Western European colonizers, and combination of that and revolutionary movements in Africa to get them out also played into giving more autonomy to the locals. But you can see the carving up of Africa led to some bad problems after the Europeans left. A lot of tribal warfare about whose boundaries were where, and didn't end well for the Africans. I'm going to move now to look at the effect of a state's shape. Yes, believe it or not, a shape of a state could play a role in the effectiveness of a state. States may, and you can turn to page 222 at this juncture, the visual there. Take a look at some of these shapes and talk about. States may be described in terms of their size, their shape and location, both absolute and relative location. Each attribute affects the state's stability and well-being. States have core areas or heartlands of importance and greatest development. Capital cities are usually located within the core. Relocation of the capital city may signal state determination to achieve unity or to encourage development out in your peripheral zones. Let's take a look at the fills here. Size and shape affect a country's effectiveness, in that the larger one has more access to natural resources, although that's not a guarantee, as the lack of natural resources in places like Russia and Canada, your two biggest countries in the world, have become a detriment. Two biggest countries in the world, and the northern half of those countries are largely, or great swaths of those countries, I would say, certainly the northern half of Canada, is largely inhabitable, right? Now, the larger the state, the more difficult it is to have culturally homogenous populations. And when I talking about homogenous, it's a kind of a $64 way of saying sameness, right? It's also more difficult to link efficient transportation systems in larger countries, and while having large boundaries to defend. Now, shape comes into play in that countries like Sweden, Chile are long and narrow. Italy, right? And that type of shape tends to cultivate logistical problems for the government. It's expensive to link some places to the core. There's more diversity of climate, and because they're going north to south, and with resources, with diversity of climate, you have different resources. And with different resources, you have different areas of that country. You have better standards of living than other areas. So it causes some contention there. With the various climates, you have different cultures. In Sweden, it goes from north to south. You get up towards the Arctic Circle, you have the Lap peoples. The Laps, they tend to be drains on national unity. They grow. They raise reindeer. That's their standard of living. And when you get down in the cosmopolitan areas like Stockholm and Malmö, when you talk about the Laps, they're kind of laughed at. These types of shapes tend to be drains on national unity and economic strength. They're called elongated states. Now, the most efficient type of shape is one of a circle. And the shape of a circle would place the capital in the middle, and the time it took to reach other areas would be relatively the same. So the expenses for transportation infrastructure would be comparatively cheaper than that of an elongated shape. Elongated are some of the other shapes that you could see on page 222. The logic has it the borders would be easier to defend in one of these circular shapes. Easier to defend. This type of shape is considered a compact state. You could see one of those on page 222. A couple of other types of states. First one would be an exclave. An exclave is where one state is completely surrounded by another, but it's politically connected to another state. West Berlin, perfect example of this. During the Cold War, West Germany, you had West Germany and East Germany. West Germany was free, democratic. East Germany, part of the Soviet Communist bloc. Well, in the Soviet Communist bloc, you had the city of Berlin. And Berlin was divided up into 4 quadrants. The Americans had a quadrant, the British had a quadrant, so did the French, and so did the Soviets. Now, West Berlin was divided up, via the Western democracies, but it was surrounded, by East Germany, which was within the communist bloc. So, an exclave politically connected to, another state. Enclaves. And you can see an enclave over on figure 8.7 again. South Africa. Look at South Africa at the bottom right-hand side of those figures there. This is what we call a perforated state, which completely surrounds an exclave. South Africa and Lesotho are examples of this. Vatican City in Italy is also an example of this. These are um, not politically connected to what they're surrounded by. Vatican City is its own political entity in Italy. I want to move now to classification of international states, and how boundaries can be classified. And I'm trying to see if I want you guys to be turning to anything here. Yeah, why don't you turn to figure 812. Figure 812 is over on page 225. I'll get to that here in the next concept. But international boundaries, while you're turning that out, I'll just set the concept up. International boundaries, which determine the limits of state control, may be classified as natural boundaries or artificial. I'm going to break those down here in a moment. They may also be distinguished according to whether they were drawn before or after the principal features of the cultural landscape developed. Let's take a look at this. Let's go to the board. Boundary classifications. Boundaries are either natural talking about physical boundaries. Figure 812 in your textbook is a picture of the Alps. Alps separates Italy from Switzerland and France. And then you have, and this is where I'm going to camp here for the next couple of subpoints here. Then you have your artificial boundaries. And these are basically considered geometric boundaries. I mean, these are boundaries that are cordoned off by latitude, longitude, right? The western portion of the U.S.-Canadian border would be one of those. The 49th parallel. Some of the subsets to the artificial boundaries would be the subsequent boundaries. Subsequent boundaries, they were drawn up after the cultural landscape had already been formed. consequent boundaries. They were drawn to accommodate an ethnicity. Classic one there would be the lines that are drawn up in Ireland to accommodate the religious divisions between the Protestants and the Catholics in Northern Ireland. Then you have your superimposed boundaries. These were forced by an occupying country, and I think back to the map that I showed you guys with, with Africa, right? European colonizers superimposing boundaries, and then lastly here the antecedent boundaries. These are classified by settlement. Let's sit down here for this one. This might work better anyway. Antecedent boundaries, these are classified by settlement, primarily before being populated. Now, with boundaries, you have tensions, with that crop up. And there's 5 major ones we're going to take a look at, because let's just face it, proximity invites conflict. It just does. Border disputes of several types are widespread. In your labs, you're going to look at this. Water bodies, patterns of an ethnicity, and natural resources are common sources of these boundary conflicts. Let's take a look at the first one here, landlocked states, right? If a state is landlocked, and turn to page 227, figure 815. Like many other landlocked countries, the new country of South Sudan, you can see that, will have to negotiate with other countries to gain access to the sea. Its proposed pipelines might traverse as many as 3 different countries. So they're going to want to be getting along with the neighbors, right? A second type of boundary that has potential for a lot of tension would be water bodies, right? And, when you're talking about water bodies, you're talking about boundary lines, right? Boundary lines must be established when a body of water is concerned. Now, with some of these, there are different pressure points, various pressure points. For instance, with water bodies, you'd have the use of a watershed boundary. The use of a watershed boundary, and that's one that runs along some kind of a ridge or a drainage area crest on page 228. Page 228, there's a disputed boundary between Argentina and Chile in the southern Andes region that you can see there. Another pressure point water bodies would be rivers that change course. Classic example here, the southern border of Texas, Mexico, the Rio Grande River. The Rio Grande River. Another pressure point with water bodies would be where the boundary line between two countries lies in a lake, right? All of our Great Lakes. I'm thinking, yeah. I think they all, they're all bordering the U.S. and Canada. Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, Superior, right? Michigan, Huron. And then the last pressure point for water bodies would be where a river flows downstream from another country and the water use becomes an issue, especially when the water is scarce, like the Nile River region, in upper North Africa, very dry and arid. A third type of boundary tension is minority group ID. Minority group ID. With minority group ID, you have some pressure points. One of them is minority group overspill. Classic example here was during, on the road to World War II, Hitler was trying to bring the as much as the master race to Germany as he could, and the bordering country of Czechoslovakia, the western end of it, close to Germany, had a lot of Germans, a lot of German immigrants there, but they were minorities in Czechoslovakia. It was the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. And Hitler was, making an argument, making a case that that should be Germany. And he was threatening to move the military in there. And the Western powers, he basically told the West, he said, look, if you guys let me have that, I won't bother anyone again. And they let him have it. And that was the famous, all right, we have peace in our time now, from Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of Britain, after they cut this deal with Hitler. Peace in our time, no war, right? Minority group overspill. Distant ethnic group located in two countries or a home country and another as a result of ethnocentrism and nationalism. So what they try to do there is they try to create an ethnic nation from the latter. Then there's the totally contained separatist movement. A totally contained separatist movement. The U.S. Civil War, right? That's the as good as an example as any, right? The U.S. Civil War. A fourth type of boundary issue would be resource disputes, probably obvious there. Example of this, again, that would involve the United States, and fortunately, it hasn't been any bloodshed over this, but the United States and Canada over the Georges Bank fishing grounds. The Magnuson Act settled this in 1984. Canada was granted the northeast corner, 200 miles off the coast of Nova Scotia. Fishing rights were the epicenter of that. Some pressure points with resource disputes, policy disagreements with neighbors, right? Like that with Canada. We have it with Mexico, right? What to do with illegals and drugs coming over from Mexico into the U.S. International significant resources in border regions would be another pressure point of resources. I remember in 1990, Saddam Hussein of Iraq invaded Kuwait for an oil reserve on the border of Iraq, Kuwait. Some of it extended into Kuwait. And Saddam Hussein, his argument was, that used to be Iraq. And he was right about that. That was carved up after the Crimean War by the British and the French in the mid-19th century, and ended up becoming, some of that area became, or where the oil fields were, became part of Kuwait. In fact, your authors have a visual of that as well on page 230. Yeah, the Rumalia oil field, one of the world's largest oil reserves, straddles the Iraq-Kuwaiti border. Iraqi grievances over Kuwaiti drilling were partly responsible for their invasion in 1990. Of course, we were concerned that Saddam controls that. He's going to, it's going to help him, raise market oil prices, and we couldn't let that happen. And the international community was all down with that with us. We put together a nice coalition under George H. Bush and moved Saddam out. And then lastly here, a fifth type of a border issue would be resources that one state claims it must have in order to survive, regardless if it's in their sovereign borders or not. And a clear, obvious example there would be the water in what is today modern-day Israel, right? Palestinian area, right? And one of the two reasons why there's been a concerted effort to move the Jews out of that area, and it's water, right? It's a very dry area, and the 1948, the 1940s exodus, emigration of Jews into that particular area and formed the new state of Israel in 1948, really got a lot of people angry and nervous in the area because water's already a rare commodity in that dry, arid region. I want to take a look now at forces, unifying forces and disruptive forces in a country. One or two of you I know are doing papers on this. And states are, as I set this up here, states are subject to both what we call centripetal and centrifugal forces. And in the process, they gain strength from institutions that promote nationalism, from effective organization, and from transportation and communication networks that foster political integration. I'm going to try sitting down for this. I seem to have worked just as well as standing up. Certainly a little more comfortable too. talk about centripetal forces, we're talking about those forces that unify us. Olympics are probably one of those things in the sporting world, unifies us. I'm thinking perhaps the coronavirus could serve to be a centripetal force, bringing us together, making some sacrifices for one another. Centrifugal forces, just the opposite. They disrupt unity, right? Think of politics, right? A political season. Nationalism can fill both forces. I mean, nationalism can serve as a badge that rallies folks around national goals. In light, however, that few countries are completely, there's that $64 word again, homogenous, the same. It can act as a centrifugal force as well. National camaraderie can be achieved through elementary schools where kids primarily learn about their own country, the military, and maybe a state church, which we're not familiar with here as they are in Europe. A state church can be rallying points as well. The government can be a rallying symbol too if it's fair in its distribution of resources, right? And finally, transportation systems can serve as a rallying point. Nevertheless, divisive forces are present in societies, and in many countries, you have separatist movements that threaten state cohesion as well. Let's take a look at autonomous movements, separatist movements. Autonomous movements, they share the same characteristics in that they occupy a specific territory and they feel overlooked. They feel overlooked by the core political engine of the country, and they therefore identify with the region, right, than with the state. Some of the most active movements are in Quebec, Canada, right, French province of Canada, in the United Kingdom, Scotland and Wales have movements in there that referendums to break off from the United Kingdom. Scotland had one within the last 10 years, I think, and maybe it was back in 2010, and there was a referendum that, but it didn't pass to leave the United Kingdom. And Spain, we took a look at earlier at a visual of the Basque movement, the Basques, page 235. Page 235. Maybe we didn't take a look at a visual there, but the Basque movement. They're in northern Spain. They border it borders France. Yeah, page 229. Basque region in the brown, straddling the border between Spain and France. And what the Basques will do, probably once a year, they will blow something up down in the capital of Madrid to remind the Spanish government of their existence and their needs or demands. The movements, such as the Basques, the movement tend to be, these movements tend to be away from the, I'm trying to think of a way to say this here, central moving and shaking of domestic politics. They're generally out in the rural areas, therefore causing them to further feel excluded. They look at the dominant group. The dominant group as also seen to them as exploiting and suppressing via language, social benefits, etc., etc. You get the picture. Let's take a look now at boundaries out on the sea, right? Yes, mankind is that territorial, right? We have to have boundaries on the sea, recognizing the economic and political military benefits of cooperation. States have banded together in a variety of supranational associations. The UN, right? NATO, the European Union, OPEC, and other alliances, both global and regional, are at least temporary associations of states cooperating in these defined ways to achieve some common objectives. The United Nations has been instrumental in formulating an international law of the sea in order to combat proliferating and conflicting territorial claims made upon the world's oceans, yes. The United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea delimits territorial boundaries and rights by defining zones of diminishing state control. Important ramifications flow from the concept of 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zones called the EEC. You're going to need a visual for this one. This will be very helpful. Turn to page 238, figure 824. I'm going to talk about this now. I'm going to break it down, but the authors do a really nice job here with the visual. Kind of looking at the fills here. Territorial sovereignty up to 12 nautical miles in breadth. Territorial sovereignty up to 12 nautical miles in breadth. And we're talking here about 12 miles from the coast of a particular state, all right? So there, within those 12 miles, all vessels have the right of passage through that zone. Now, if you're a military or a research vessel, you may be stopped, okay? We talk about a nautical mile, nautical miles, we're talking about, 60,000 feet, about 800 feet longer than the statute mile. The contagious zone goes up to 24 miles. States can enforce laws out there even though they do not have entire sovereignty. The exclusive economic zone, the EEZ, this area is up to 200 nautical miles. The state acknowledges the right to work with natural resources. States there can claim rights to resources within the continental shelf up to 350 miles out. However, there is freedom of the seas that are to be maintained. And then you see the high seas there on the graph. On the graphic, the high seas are open to all. And the idea there is that it basically recognizes the deep seabed and its resources as basically the common heritage of mankind. Lastly, in most countries, the actions of sub-national political organizations have had a direct impact on people. And where I'm heading here is political boundaries. Two aspects of political organization of interest are representation and fragmentation of power. The way boundaries are drawn around voting districts can maximize or minimize power of a group of people. Gerrymandering. Gerrymandering can unfairly favor one political party over another. In the United States, a great many local governmental units have developed, many with overlapping jurisdiction and responsibility. Turn to page 244. I want you to take a look at the original gerrymander. Page 244, figure 830, and I'll read that caption. The term gerrymander originated in 1811 from the shape of an electoral district formed in Massachusetts while Elbridge Gerry was governor. When an artist added certain animal features, the district resembled a salamander and quickly came to be called a gerrymander, after the name of the Massachusetts governor. Let's take a look at this here. What this is all about. Gerrymandering, the method of drawing voting districts to favor one's political party or particular politicians. And I might note too, you can Google this. I don't have the technology to show this to you, or the knowledge to do it. But pardon me, we live in the 12th district of Pennsylvania. In the 12th district, Google the shape of that. I don't know what you can compare it to, but we arguably live in the most gerrymandered district in the country. And John Murtha was the Democrat representative up until 2010, until he died. Long time incumbent. And but some of the surrounding districts were Republican. But in some of those Republican areas, you had some union towns, and union towns generally vote Democrat. So it was carved in a way where those towns were grafted into Mertha's district. Mertha had a lot of, he had Indiana County. Indiana County's fairly Republican. They sliced off parts of that, but they kept the town of Indiana in his district. The town of Indiana is where the university is. Most people in this field of academics, probably 80 to 90%, vote with the Democratic ticket. So there are a lot of students, right? So, I mean, that's just kind of the way these things work. So the way boundaries are drawn up can make or break the power of a particular group. And this invariably affects voting results. So this basically affects voting results. They're a way for parties to cut deals and provide safe seats for the incumbents, right? An incumbent is the person who's already, has the seat, has the position. So it's been known as an incumbent protection racket. And, arguably maybe a threat to democracy. I'm going to show you an example I can think of and draw up here. That'd be easy. It'd be just tough for me to try to draw the 12th congressional district, but I urge you to Google that, look at the shape of it, and read a little bit about that. back in, I think it was back in the 90s in North Carolina. There was a congressman. I can't remember his first name. His last name was Watt. And I'll never forget this. This was classic gerrymandering. Watt had a district that I-95, a good swath of it, I-95 went through his district. And it was, it was fairly a wide circle around I-95. And I'm not picking on Watt because of his political party. I just remember he was a Democrat. And Watt, but gradually North Carolina is a burgeoning healthcare state. So you had a lot of people moving in on these, the outlier areas from out of state. And they weren't necessarily, I guess they were doing polls. They weren't necessarily Democrats, right? And so what the powers that be did, Democrats and the Republicans, instead of the Republicans risking losing a close election to Watt, and the Democrats didn't want to risk losing the district either, a lot of the Republicans are moving in. What they both did is they cut this deal where Watt's district would be closer to I-95. Now, I-95 was, 90% African American in that corridor. And African Americans generally, and certainly there, vote 90 to 100% for the Democratic ticket. So basically, by shaving all that off, they kind of gave a seat to a chance for a seat to Republicans, but Watt was able to keep his seat. So that's how the parties kind of work together in these in these matters. So it's kind of harder to vote the bums out, as they used to say. If you don't like way of what a politician's doing, you can vote the bum out in 2 or 4 years. But gerrymandering makes that difficult to do. So that's chapter 8, political geography. Let me just recap where we were, and I'll talk about what's up ahead and what you guys, what I'm going to be expecting for you guys during this class period. We looked at political geography. We looked at states, right? Political entities with sovereign control of its foreign and domestic decisions. Nations, right? These are the people that occupy that state. They share cultural characteristics, and this could result in strong ethnocentrism. Nation states, these are the boundaries. These are the boundaries of the nation. We talked about size and shapes of states, right? The large states, several difficulties with those, right? Lack of cultural homogeneity, too many transportation links, large boundaries to defend. Your elongated shapes, they're expensive to link places to the core, diversity of climate, diversity in resources and cultures, and it can drain national unity, all these things. Compact state, generally the optimum shape that you want, right? Easier to get resources, it's to all people, most efficient. Probably the optimal shape there. Talk about enclaves, right? States completely surrounded by an exclave, not politically connected to another state. Exclaves, states completely surrounded by another, and they are politically connected to another state. Boundaries, we looked at 2 types of boundaries. You have your natural boundaries, which are, physical boundaries, mountains, rivers, deserts, right? These types of things. And then your artificial boundaries. These are geometric boundaries, and there are different subsets to the artificial. You have your subsequent boundaries drawn up after the cultural landscape was made. You had your antecedent boundaries drawn up before there was any kind of development, and your consequent boundaries to accommodate some kind of ethnicity. And then your bad ones, right? Superimposed boundaries, forced boundaries by occupiers. Talked about boundary conflicts, landlocked states. You have water bodies and the several pressure points there. Minority group ID, pressure points there. Resource disputes, right? Several pressure points there as well. Forces within a state, right? Centripetal, these are unifying forces, and your centrifugal, these are disrupting forces. Somewhat related to the boundary conflicts, but a little different. You got your autonomous movements, right? This is connected to forces within a state. Autonomous movements, certainly centrifugal, right? They're disrupting forces, or they can be. Minority groups identifying with a region, they feel overlooked, generally in rural areas. And then water boundaries, right? Interesting concept, right? Territorial state, right? The territorial state has sovereignty of their waters 12 nautical miles out. Contagious zone, state has sovereignty 25 miles out. Then the EEZ, the exclusive economic zone, 200 nautical miles out. So there's stipulations on who can be in these areas, right? And this is set up by the UN, United Nations Law of the Sea. And high seas are open to everyone. High seas are open to everyone. And then lastly, the governmental units, your voting districts, gerrymandering, and how political boundaries are set up, right? Maybe in not so not so democratic ways. So that's that for chapter 8. On your if you didn't see my update, I have some comprehension questions, which is going to count as your attendance, right? And I'm going to have that open until 5 o'clock. Just go by your notes, look at your notes, and you'll be able to answer those comprehension questions, right? And they'll also be good for the forthcoming quiz, right? Helping you internalize the material. That quiz will be a week from today, right? On March the 30th. And Wednesday, I will have some practice material for you guys to do, and it'll be set up for this time period, 3:15 to 4:30. Your lab will be due a week from today as well. I'll have that that's posted, should be posted and ready to go for you guys to look at. And I'll let you know if there's anything I'm forgetting or anything changes. So you guys stay well out there, and I'll talk to you next time. Any questions or comments at any time, don't hesitate to send me send me a message. If you guys are interested in doing Zoom, let me know about that too. I do have those capabilities here as well. So again, stay well. I'll talk to you next time.